The Coen brothers are, in my opinion, the best directors working today. They have films that cover multiple genres and subject matters to varying degrees of success. From drama to comedies, from remakes to adaptations, there's literally nothing they haven't done across the 18 films that they made together. And even though Joel and Ethan have gone in their own directions in recent years, they have left a great body of work behind them. Some are definitely better than others though. Nobody's perfect. But even at their worst, they have always done something interesting with their films, and have tried, at the very least, to build off an interesting concept. That is why today I'm going to be ranking all 18 of them, from worst to best, seeing how their career has taken shape over the years, and hopefully explaining why, even despite their slip-ups, they are my favorite directors. Also, I do mean 18. I'm not counting Macbeth or any of the movies that Ethan has written for other people, so don't make me choose sides in this divorce, okay? While the film's credits say that this movie was written by the Coen brothers, I have a hard time believing it. Despite having a sort of interesting premise of a divorce lawyer falling in love with a gold digger, the problem with the film is that it lacks the characteristics of what makes their films unique. The sense of humor this movie has is juvenile and dull. It lacks the heart of something as stupid as Raising Arizona has in spades. A lot of the jokes are really forgettable, and the characters are characterless. There are multiple times in this movie where the movie made me cringe. Especially the joke, the reoccurring gag of George Clooney's reaction, and it's just him and his sidekick doing the scream from Home Alone. And that's the joke. The chemistry between George Clooney and Catherine Zeta-Jones is non-existent, which makes the film make less sense and less engaging, since the actors seem not to be engaged with one another. Even the cinematography is boring. If you told me that the man who was responsible for shooting a film like 1917 and The Shawshank Redemption made this, a film that looks indistinguishable from a Happy Madison production, I would not believe you, but it is somehow true. Intolerable Cruelty feels like a movie that wasn't written by the Coen brothers, which makes a lot of sense, because it was also written by 3 other writers who are most famous for writing such hit movies as Man of the House, Lincoln Lawyer, and Life. This movie is just so replaceable. It may be a Coen brother film, but really, Intolerable Cruelty is just one among the hundreds of replaceable and forgettable comedies that came out in the 2000s. You know what? I feel like I should hate this movie a lot more than I do. It's a remake of the 1955 Alexander McKendrick film of the same name, which follows a heist gone right with a getaway gone horribly wrong. At the same time, everything in how the movie is executed is also wrong. Every actor in the film does a nonchalant performance, including Tom Hanks, who for some reason does his entire performance with a Cajun accent. And yes, it is as irritating as it sounds. Did I mention he's the main character? I think the premise of the film is interesting enough to elevate some of what happens in the movie, and I can see why they wanted to attempt a remake since it is so unique, especially with the twist it takes on. But again, like with Intolerable Cruelty, it is lost to its dumb and juvenile humor that comes across in an off-putting way. Like, it has a lot of poop jokes, mostly gravitating around J.K. Simmons' character having irritable bowel syndrome, and it feels like most of it is inserted to make the film be more conventionally funnier, instead of the dark irony you would get out of the premise alone. I will say that there are some really good shots in the film, and that Roger Deakins, despite being chained to the run-of-the-mill comedy, finds a way to shoot something in an interesting way, despite his restriction. Whatever the original Lady Killers had was completely dumbed down to try to appeal to the crowd that was going to see a comedy movie back in the 2000s. But at this point in time, there were so many other films doing that type of humor better that it just got lost to the sands of time. Deservedly so. Hudsucker Proxy is a film that tries to capitalize on what they were doing with Barton Fink, but it feels like they have nothing really interesting to say. Like with Intolerable Cruelty, it reeks of the era it came from. I say that mainly just because it stars Tim Robbins, an actor who I will forever associate with the 90s, who plays a fresh out of college businessman thrown to the top of a corporation and then hijinks ensue. Or so you'd think. With a premise like that, you could get a lot of potential mileage out of it, but they use it in a very limited way. It also leads to very little insight or interesting dialogue from the characters, which makes the movie all the more bland and middling, which is why I think this film would be so much better if it had a comedian like Robin Williams or even an Adam Sandler. Would fit a lot better in this type of role, where the main character's actions feel like they're validating the board's disbelief in him. Like at the business dinner scene, where he acts for the most part like a normal human being would, but it could have led to some really interesting gags involving his interactions with the upper class in a fish out of water scenario. But it leads to one gag the whole time involving him upsetting a Finnish guy. The other gags in the film are far and few between, like his concept design for a hula hoop just being a circle, which is supposed to get some yucks out of you. Instead, it just leaves you shrugging it off and thinking, yeah, I get it. Hudsucker Proxy is half-baked at best and meandering at worst. It's wasted potential for such an interesting premise, and even though it feels like Tim Robbins is miscast in the film, I think that he, along with everyone else in the film, gives an adequate performance. And there are a few handful of cool shots that Roger Deakins does throughout the movie, but those interesting ideas leave so much more to be desired out of the film.
I hate cows worse than cappers.
I feel like there's a pattern in the Coen brothers films that I don't like, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is another example of that. It is just another 2000s comedy, a lot like the other films that I've talked about so far. It follows three convicts fleeing their chains and going on a voyage across the deep south in search of treasure. The difference is there are more plot points that I actually enjoyed, and I see why people enjoy this film so much, but it didn't work for me. They managed to get a lot of cool concepts out of the era that the film takes place in, like how the main characters stumble into a radio station and magically become sensations, or many of the interesting characters they meet along the way. But I feel like those things aren't given enough room to fully develop, and that the structure of the plot yanks you out from any idea you might have actually liked. Like, it hits the beats of a comedy film too often, especially the stuff with Everett and his ex-wife, which comes off as just a generic trope that you could see in any movie. I also think that the music was a bit overemphasized in the film. Like, we get it, it's cool, you guys sold the soundtrack and, made it sound like this old-timey ragtime music, but you don't need the full song to be played in the movie, just because you're selling the soundtrack on a CD. And to be honest, it's not even the best soundtrack. The humor of the film is nothing special, and it's not bad, it's inoffensive, but I don't think it's that good. The best thing about Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is what it does with its setting, which loses a lot of its luster since you just get thrown about to the film structure and just fall into one trope after another. But again, it is not a bad movie. It just leaves so much to be desired, just like with Hudsucker Proxy.
Would that it was so simple.
Why are you doing this?
Would that it was
Just keep still.
After not seeing Hail Caesar since its release back in 2015 and rewatching it for this video, I can say for certain that Hail Caesar is a movie that leaves me the most conflicted on whether I like it or not out of this list. And par for the course for a film placed at this part of the list, its potential is never fully realized. The film follows Eddie Mannix, played by Josh Brolin, as he goes through his eccentric escapades that entangle him at the film studio he works for. The film does a decent job balancing the different narratives out and making sure that it doesn't get too stale after a while. Each of the narratives revolves around a different aspect of Hollywood's golden age and taking a look at the absurdity of the convoluted lifestyle that Hollywood stars lived. Some of that stuff does feel like a retread of what they were doing on earlier films, where they look at Hollywood as an industry and seeing how infuriating the work can be to do something as difficult as make a movie. But Hail Caesar is nowhere near that cynical. There are sequences in the film that feel as if they're lavishing in the golden age of Hollywood, Hollywood. It has a handful of sequences that just exist to show off really good choreography, as if it were a musical. Those sequences, while romantic and nostalgic in the moment, just feel wasteful. They remind me a bit of La La Land, where it has these incredible song and dance sequences, but ultimately feels like a substanceless throwback that does nothing but look good. While Hail Caesar may have some shallow sentimentality behind the film, it has their brand of wit and comedy that they are renowned for. The overall narrative that follows Eddie Mannix is pretty good, and I love how the film feels like just another episode in these characters' lives instead of the film's plot being the pinnacle of their life. The film's sense of humor is pretty hit or miss, which is probably the weakest part, but the misses don't happen often enough to drag it down for me, and lead to a flawed but somewhat enjoyable experience.
Well, which is it, young feller? You want ice that freeze or get down on the ground?
Raising Arizona as a follow-up to something like Blood Simple feels completely out of left field. To go from a slow burn thriller to a screwball buddy comedy is a move very few people can pull off, but the Coen brothers can. The film follows H.I., played by Nicolas Cage, and Edwina, played by Holly Hunter, as they try to kidnap a child and raise it as their own. Or at least before shenanigans happen, because of course they happen. I think it gets a lot of mileage out of these concepts, and the actors play up their southern yokel characters just enough to make the movie a lot of fun, and pretty funny as well. I know someone like Nick Cage is now well known for his over-the-top acting, and this film is certainly over the top, but he never overshadows the film or any of the actors in that way. This isn't Vampire's Kiss, okay? Where the entire film works only because Nicolas Cage cranks it up to 1,000. No, the actors feel naturally comedic, and they have natural comedic chemistry together, and that's what carries the movie for me. My big gripe with the film, however, is that it never really tries to be anything other than an enjoyable screwball comedy. Is it a crime to rate a film this good, this low? No, but this is a ranked list of one of my favorite director's movies. It is pretty cutthroat, to say the least, if a film this enjoyable is low.
First time?
After watching Ballad of Buster Scruggs, I genuinely think that every director at some point in their career should try and do an anthology film. It distills what makes their films great and condenses it into smaller stories. Just look at what Wes Anderson did with French Dispatch last year. It not only shows how much heart his films have, it is probably the best film he has made in decades. Something similar can be said about The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. After how underwhelming Hail Caesar was, they needed to go back to basics and make something effective. And that's what all the stories in Ballad of Buster Scruggs are. They range from intense to comedic, from lighthearted to tragic. I think that each of them are distinct and memorable, and with that, the emotional range Buster Scruggs accomplishes, we can see how vast the storytelling can be, even with a simple genre format like a Western. However, I think that this film suffers from the main problem that comes with making an anthology film, and that problem is that some of the stories within the anthology are definitely better than the others. I think that after the episode with Tom Waits playing the prospector is done, my interest in the other two stories kinda dropped. However, I enjoyed the drama with the wagon train story and the intrigue from the carriage ride conversation, but you really can't top Tom Waits acting like a crazy old man for 20 minutes. And with that, I can say Ballad of Buster Scruggs is a perfect movie to land on any streaming service, just like Netflix, because of its anthology structure and how distinct and memorable it is. Too bad they can't do that with any of their anime adaptations.
Welcome to the ass, motherfuckers!
I know who the guy is.
The guy?
I really wanted to like Burn After Reading a lot more. I really did. It has great acting, it has a great story, and the Coen's cynical sense of humor. But fuck, some of the characters are just so goddamn annoying. Burn After Reading follows the intertwining story revolving around an FBI agent's memoir getting leaked and how each side tries to one-up one another throughout. I think that the best part of about the character's game of cat and mouse is how incompetent and petty it seems. Well, that's because it's a lot like the characters of the movie. Petty and incompetent. With the ensemble cast in the film, they truly have a wide variety of characters going, and most of them are well performed in their over-the-top and eccentric manner, like the raging asshole character that John Malkovich plays, or the moronic ladies' man that George Clooney plays, which he somehow pulls off. But man, every time Brad Pitt and Frances McDormand pop onto fucking screen, it makes me want to turn it off. They're too cartoonishly moronic, even for a film like this. Everyone else in the film is a moron too, yes, but believably so. It's the biggest obstacle the film has to overcome, and it does a decent job at it. And I genuinely can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually liked George Clooney in this film. For once, in so many movies I have seen him in, I can never get past how he is typecast, but in Burn After Reading, they play off of his typecast so masterfully. Burn After Reading could have been higher on my list, since it does so many things right, but for every step in the right direction they take, there's a moronic interlude blocking its path.
I'm just a grifter, I'm a nobody. But I'll tell you what, I never crossed a friend, I never killed anybody, never crossed a friend. No, you will bet. We're not like those animals.
Miller's Crossing is where the Coen brothers start to develop their specific worldview of characters, where everything seems in some way inconsequential to the larger picture of the world or the continuous story in the world. But in attempting to make a movie with that in mind, it ultimately leads them to fall short with how they deliver it. The story follows a middleman of the mafia played by Gabriel Byrne, and as he navigates both sides of a gang war. I know, for a film like this, it is possible to have humor when doing something that is both simultaneously extensive and specific, and a couple films later on in this list do that, but they also do that a lot better than Miller's Crossing does. The dryness comes from how the main characters acted, and how he seems so forgettable in this larger story, when he should at least have some pretense of being memorable to make us care about the story. I say that, but somehow the story is actually pretty engaging, despite the fact that they have a blank slate of a main character. All the surrounding characters are much more interesting, and the actions of the main character really build up his surroundings instead of himself. The way that the plot progresses leaves him as the least developed part of it, and it really makes it uninteresting to watch Gabriel Byrne on screen. The narrative of the film definitely supersedes the characters in Miller Crossing, and the waddling story is enjoyable, but it doesn't give you enough to grab onto, but still doesn't know if it wants to be serious or comedic, and it seems that the Coens haven't figured out how to walk that tightrope just yet, but it is definitely a great first attempt at trying something like that.
I don't think you're gonna do it.
What do you think now?
After making such a great hit with The Lady Killers, the Coens decided to remake another classic movie that didn't need a remake, but instead of dumbing down the movie, they decided to update it to modern audiences. It was an audacious task for them to do considering the original's award-winning reputation, and I think that they managed to live up to that reputation. I am saying this as someone who hasn't seen the movie. True Grit follows a young girl following the trail of the man who murdered her father and her quest for vengeance with the help of loose cannon companions. I think the biggest hurdle in mind for remaking this film is that, which again, I haven't seen the original, so I'm just assuming here, would be trying to fill the void of John Wayne. As the man who is often so typecast as the cowboy, what we get from this movie is Jeff Bridges, and I think he fits the part of the curmudgeonous drunk Rooster Cogburn, one of the hired guns that join her on her journey, perfectly. It's on point, and I don't think that Jeff Bridges has ever missed, and to be honest, especially when working with the Coen brothers. Even the main character, Maddie, is well acted, and her quick-witted remarks play off of Bridges so well. What really grabs me most about the film is that the director's distinct voices still shine through, even in a remake. I think that they managed to develop the characters and their relationships uniquely. This is seen mainly in the relationship between Cogburn and Maddie, which feels like the main main focus of the film. Since the film is about them trying to hunt down Tom Chaney, their snappy back and forths they have during their journey through the Wild West, which slowly evolves from there to be about their friendship, sort of, in a father-daughter way. The film looks great, and it also does a decent job at showcasing how dry the West was at the time. And it does a great job of never letting the cinematography overwhelm the story. It's nothing flashy like the other films I've talked on this list, but it is a great modern Western that just so happens to be a remake of an older film. It's simple fun, and I enjoyed it as such.
Look, something is very wrong. I don't want Santana Abraxas. I've just been in a terrible auto accident.
With so many dominant personalities, none of which were as good as Michael Stuhlbarg playing Larry Gopnik, a man struggling through the abrupt ending of his marriage and the counsel he seeks from 3 rabbis about what to do next. Now, I know what you're thinking. How can you make a film that follows the day-to-day life of some boring schmuck interesting? By having him overreact to everything. I think his delivery of the lines makes everything he does gold, and it's not really an exaggerated overreaction that you would see in someone like Will Ferrell and Adam Sandler, where they are playing up them being morons. It feels like a reaction from someone trying to maintain a level-headed response, but struggling to do, just because of how unreal it feels to him. And I think the most unique thing about this film in particular is the unique way that it does something as unrealistic as a dream sequence, but somehow making it look very plain, just like the rest of the film. Everything in A Serious Man is plain, and is shot plainly, because the story, despite having absurd twists and turns, still feels like a plain, realistic story. Maybe it was their way of trying to distance some of the checkered comedies they made that decade, or some way of dissing their doltish competition by having such a natural feeling story while being simultaneously funny and having everything made with great comedic timing. And it is one of the most unforgettable comedies to be put out in the 2000s.
Why'd you take these?
What do you mean? Just doing my job?
So, this is where it all began, their debut feature, fresh out of NYU, and after helping Sam Raimi out with the first Evil Dead movie, they decided to throw their own hat into the ring with Blood Simple. This film centers around the attempted hit a bar owner puts on his own wife and his wife's lover, and the situation complicates from there. As a debut film, it shows the promise that they had as filmmakers to create an engaging and unique thriller that keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire time while watching it. It's the foundation of everything they would later go on to perfect in making No Country for Old Men. Its action, while being subdued, is gripping. It lets the suspenseful atmosphere of each encounter build up to a satisfying climax. The cinematography is a bit showy at times, which, to be fair, is a common problem in directors' debut films, but this film in particular leans on the idea of using Chekhov's gun a lot, which means it shows us something that implies that it will be used later on in the film, and while I understand its use to help escalate the situations, there's a point where it can get a bit much. I also feel like the pacing of the film was a bit slower than I'd like it to be. And before you write these complaints off as petty nitpicks, I should say that this is the extent of my problems that I had with the film. What can I say? They hit it out of the park straight from their debut feature. The minor issues I had with it don't stop it from being one of the most criminally underrated crime thrillers with great performances, especially from longtime Coen cohort and eventual wife of Ethan Coen, Frances McDormand, long before she decided to make pretentious pseudo-films pretending to be poor, who plays the bar owner's wife, Abby. She, alongside the rest of the cast, give a performance that makes the film feel 100% realistic, and their actions come off as equally realistic, which creates an experience that completely absorbs the viewer. It ultimately makes for a great slow burn of a movie that complements the rest of their career so perfectly while still being a great film on its own right.
Yeah, like hell it is. You know, mosquitoes in Los Angeles. Mosquitoes breed in swamps. This is a desert.
What do you got for me?
I think I understand why Barton Fink took away the prestigious Palme d'Or award at Cannes Film Festival upon its release, unlike the rest of their films. It's probably one of the biggest indictments of the Hollywood system and the creative process ever made by a major Hollywood studio. It follows the titular Barton Fink, played by John Turturro, as he moves away from the snobbish Broadway scene into the Hollywood limelight, where he is tasked to write the next big hit movie. The only problem is, he doesn't know what to do. What follows is Fink's attempt to try and acclimate to the system and trying to write within the confines of it, or simply just trying to write at all. I think the parallel between writer's block and the Hollywood experience fits perfectly. It captures the feeling of knowing what to write, just not how to write it, a feeling I am all too familiar with. Case in point, how long it's been since my last video. These serve as a grand allegory for the type of stuff that the Coens had to deal with then, and obviously would continue to deal with as their career went on. The film doesn't give a clear-cut way of dealing with these issues, but it clearly outlines all of them. It doesn't bask in the adoring glow of classic Hollywood like something like Hail Caesar does. Most of the film just consists of the back and forths, shot and reverse shots, which allows the characters to express themselves with simple locations like offices, apartment buildings, and hotel rooms. It grounds the film and makes the film industry feel undefined and like a nebulous force that acts on Bart. The film is one of the best portrayals of the creative process that goes into the movie industry. And even though it's a well fleshed out allegory, Barton Fink does feel a bit abrupt with how it ends, and it kind of puts a damper on the whole film in my opinion. But I thoroughly enjoyed it despite that abrupt ending.
Me, I don't talk much. I just cut the hair.
Speaking of underrated, The Man Who Wasn't There is probably the most underrated film in the Coen brothers' filmography. It's a moody, dry throwback to an old-school noir thriller that feels like it got lost in their body of work just because of how diverse it is. It follows Ed Crane, played by Billy Bob Thornton, who decides on a whim to blackmail his adulterous wife and her lover out of money, only to have the situation convolute from there. The most startling thing compared to the films that I've talked about thus far is that this film is entirely black and white. It's used further to add to the throwback to a story that was already in itself a throwback. It feels like the film that Lady Killers wanted to be. The story has so many clever twists involved and makes for an interesting character study of Ed Crane somehow, at the same time as showcasing his reaction to the situation and honestly how mundane it is. And that's what I think the best part of the film is. It's Ed's reaction to all of it. And unlike Gabriel Byrne's dry reaction to the situation in Miller's Crossing, I think that because of how attached Ed is to the situation, his sense of involvement doesn't feel like it allows him to be that detached, but somehow he is. And traditionally speaking, it's not a performance that you would consider to be great. It's a performance that's intentionally lacking. Billy Bob Thornton gives this stone-faced and stoic performance that makes it feel like the character has a disconnect from the world, and coupled with his blunt way of speaking, it makes for a really interesting character to watch as he deals with this situation and this ever-evolving plot. The performance feels like a riff on the stoic type of character that used to be in so many noir films back in the 40s and 50s. They're usually seen as an observer of the situation or an investigator of the movie's central plot, but not the instigator. I get why The Man Who Wasn't There didn't reach a broader audience upon its release and eventually flopped. It's in black and white, it's pretty dry, and in comparison to the last few movies, it's lacking in terms of star power and things that are outwardly appealing about their movies. But I was utterly captivated by the film, and The Man Who Wasn't There is a complete gem that should not go unwatched.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 second, please.
This is probably the most bitter film on the list, and when it comes to the Coen brothers, that says a lot. Inside Llewyn Davis is a look into the life of a struggling folk singer, Llewyn Davis, played by Oscar Isaac, trying to make it in Greenwich Village during the heyday of the 60s folk scene, where artists like Bob Dylan famously got their start. Despite having such a well-known setting and figures involved with it, it opts to make a fictitious no-name singer, basing several elements of the character off of a real-life no-name singer in a way to try and distance itself from the iconography of the era, and remove the nostalgic romance that so many biopics tend to give. Through the many characters in Llewellyn's life, we learn about him and the routine he has that is the driving force for his nihilistic outlook on life. Oscar Isaac gives, in my opinion, a career-best performance, portraying Llewyn Davis and somehow actually singing the songs that Llewyn performs on screen. He manages to pour every ounce of emotion into his vocal performance and makes me wonder why he never had a career in music. The other characters in the film also feel incredibly distinct and memorable, despite being completely overshadowed by the self-centered perspective of the main character. From mere acquaintances to close friends and even ex-lovers, we see how his crass personality affects those around him and how in return it continues to affect him. Seeing people like Adam Driver, Justin Timberlake, and even a Coen mainstay like John Goodman imprints a distinct impression of their individual characters, no matter how brief their role may be. Each of their interactions allow for this to happen, and allows for tons of memorable moments throughout the film. The cinematography of the film, on the other hand, captures the feeling of a cold and bitter winter that feels never-ending, and as someone who lives in the Midwest, it's something I'm all too familiar with. It perfectly fits the tone of the film, a movie that's bitter with specks of dark comedy throughout, and somehow oddly allegorical. With its perfect casting and unique narrative, Inside Llewyn Davis is definitely one of the Coen's most standout films. With all that being said, there's no way I'm not getting flack for my next placement. I can already hear the mobs of people ready to pounce on me with sharply worded comments, detesting me and trying to prod me about why my opinion is wrong. Let's just get it over with.
I don't know. I couldn't say. Call it.
For many, this is the definitive Coen Brothers film, with no exception. While I wouldn't disagree with them, I would say that this video is my subjective opinion, and if you made it to this point in this long-ass video, it means that you put enough value in my subjective opinion more than I would ever put in any of yours. So at this point, you might as well just hear me out, right? My initial problem with No Country for Old Men was that the pacing of the film was too slow, and that it was never able to fully grasp my attention while watching it. Upon rewatching it, however, while I'm not a fan of how the film is paced, this still manages to completely enrapture me, and I finally understood why it was paced like that. They were trying to make the ultimate Western. Despite me making such a bold claim to a heavily populated genre like the Westerns, I think that the majority of Westerns since the inception of the genre don't rely on that kind of pacing. Westerns began by revolving around a setting or a story that places itself on the Wild West of America during the 1800s, then it evolved into something more than just a genre of film. It became a way of articulating the tension in the air, a focused glance in the scorching desert sun, a lingering shot revealing something more. This brings to mind something like Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West, which opens with an extensive shot revealing the main character and the vastness of the setting as he exists in, and it goes on for an incredibly long time. While they may not have done something as expansive as that, they managed to use and even perfect similar techniques to make one of the most tense films ever put on screen. With it, they managed to capture the gritty and stoic nature of the original Cormac McCarthy novel and make for one of the best, if not the best Western. The environment is nothing without a story to fill it, however, and in it, we see a cat-and-mouse game between Llewyn Moss and Anton Chigurh, as well as everything the game leaves in its wake. Every scene in the film with either of those two characters is pure gold, whether it be Josh Brolin as Llewyn or Javier Bardem as Anton. They both give an authentic performance, especially Josh Brolin, who plays everything calmly, even in the face of unstoppable demise. Not to discount Javier Bardem in any way, of course. They both give a performance of a lifetime in this film, just in different ways. Many people have said that Anton Chigurh is one of the best film villains in history, and I, for one, wholeheartedly agree. For a category that is predominantly made up of performances where charisma and cleverness are usually definitive traits, it's unusual to see someone like Anton amongst the ranks. Anton isn't charismatic, but what defines him most is how unstoppable he seems. Granted, he isn't a Terminator. He can actually get hurt, as we see in the film, but does it stop him? No. Javier Bardem's performance exudes the cold sociopathy necessary to convey that, and every actor that has an interaction with him on screen gives the feeling of tension just from a single exchange. This film is built on those small exchanges, even with something insignificant like buying hunting supplies, checking into a hotel, or paying for gas. No Country for Old Men makes every scene feel as momentous as the last, and creates a film that won't let you move from the edge of your seat until the end credits roll.
Oh, jeez. Here's the second one.
I guess it makes sense, in some cosmic sort of way, to go from talking about the ultimate Western movie to talking about the ultimate Midwestern movie. Fargo is a movie that captures the eccentricities of the Midwest and uses them to provide a much-needed levity to an otherwise serious crime drama. It makes the movie one of the most unique black comedies ever put on the big screen. The use of comedy in the film, in my opinion, is something more than just simple levity, however. Its use in the film melts the tension and finds a balance in the harshness of the film. Maybe I'm biased in saying so, as someone who grew up in the frozen tundra of Minnesota, but I think the quaintness and the eccentricities that come with being a Minnesotan highlight each interaction in the film. From the over-the-top accents to the vernacular that comes with it, it makes the characters feel authentic, while also hilarious. The absurdity of the situation allows for both comedy and drama to flourish. I mean, the initial incident of the film only happens because of the main character's incompetence and only snowballs out of control from there. And, you know, the premise seems simple enough. A man wants to get some money from his wife's rich father by setting up her kidnapping, but somehow he manages to screw up everything, and everything manages to go extremely wrong. The consistent tone that the actors play their scenes in allows for the balancing act that I was talking about earlier, like none other. How the movie does that is that it presents the scenes which are closest to the situation being handled more dramatically, but as you get further into exploring the characters, it shows their range more. And it gives each of the characters range, and builds them up more outside of the story when you do it that way. And it makes them feel like real people, instead of characters belonging in a movie. That, right there, is what makes me gravitate towards this movie so much. It's reality. The movie itself states that it is based on a real-life case that happened, or so it claims. Upon further reading, the story that the film comes from is actually several different stories put together, but the Coens managed to stitch it together so seamlessly, you probably just accepted it as the story they told. And I can't blame you. What makes this reality so unique, in my opinion, is that the situation is handled realistically, and so the characters react as such. That reaction doesn't mean the situation is played straight, however, as I was saying before, the balancing act is a fine line that they walk perfectly with the help of the actors, because to some extent, there is some comedy to be found even in a tragedy. And now, I know that might sound like something the Joker would say, but the way that they handle it is that it allows the tragedy to be a tragedy, but still have levity interspersed. It gives you an understanding that this is an actual world that has characters with stories that are beyond what we see on screen. Not in a way that leaves loose ends. At the end, all of the characters have their story wrapped up for what we see of them. It doesn't go on necessarily to show what happens after the case is closed. That's why the final scene of the movie doesn't even revolve around the main story. It's Marge and her husband laying in bed, enjoying each other's company, as it were just another day in their life. Which it is. That's why I have such a deep love for Fargo. Not because of the familiar setting, not because of the tremendous all-around great acting, but because the movie feels so real, and everyone in the movie handles it like it's a real case that you might come across as a cop who has a life beyond being a cop. Of course, the reason it initially did grab me was the setting, but beyond that, I was able to see so much more upon repeated rewatches. And the setting only served as a hook for someone who grew up in the Midwest like myself. So, despite all that, how did a film top something that was so personal to me? How did they do it?
You might want to watch out that front window, Larry. Son, this is what happens when you fuck a stranger in the ass!
In the 90s, slacker culture had once again become mainstream, and especially with filmmakers like Richard Linklater and everyone's favorite Marvel crybaby, Kevin Smith. capturing the unique characteristics of deadbeats with too much free time on their hands. But it wasn't until 1998, when the Coen brothers released their best movie to date, The Big Lebowski, where we saw that culture hit an apex. The Big Lebowski is probably my favorite comedy film of all time. There are so many great jokes inside the film that lead it to be so incredibly rewatchable. It follows Jeffrey Lebowski, or the Dude, played by Jeff Bridges, as he gets entangled in the kidnapping plot involving another Jeffrey Lebowski and his trophy wife. And, of course, everything complicates from there. Or does it? While the film does follow the tropes of a noir detective story, with films like Chinatown or The Third Man, where an unsuspecting person gets involved with a grand conspiracy beyond their imagination, but in this film's case, there is no conspiracy. The Dude finds himself in the middle of a series of endless coincidences that propel the story forward, even though it barely can be considered a story at all. Everything in the film seems to resolve itself in some way, and is all done without the help of the main character. He's honestly just there as a bystander, rather than the main catalyst for the story, and all that the Dude does in the story is stress out about it. It's surprising to witness that contrast between his typical demeanor and how he handles this particular situation. Again, like with every Coen Brothers film, everyone in this film is perfectly cast, and plays their roles as needed. A perfect example is Julianne Moore, who plays the Dude's femme fatale. Sort of. She is the only character, because of how she acts, that feels like she was pulled straight out of the film that the Coens are playing off of. The Big Lebowski also captures the look of those noir films as well, updated of course. And of course, Roger Deakins is on his A-game, as always, making everything look like an old-school noir story, and capturing the grimy setting and still leaving plenty of room for innovation. And of course, that realism in the film allows for some contrast to be made with some of the most delightfully surreal dream sequences ever put on the big screen. And everything that the movie does just embodies all of the characteristics of the Coen brothers that I love, with its perfect casting and unique characters, and is packed to the brim full of memorable moments. It is easily Ethan and Joel's best movie, and one of my all-time favorite movies as well. But when I had this list planned out originally, I had Fargo as my number one, instead of The Big Lebowski. But upon rewatching both back-to-back, I found that despite them both having some of the same qualities that I love about their movies, especially when it comes to capturing that feeling of the plot being a small part of the larger world, in that regard, I found upon that rewatch that The Big Lebowski takes that feeling and elevates it with the characters in the movie and that slacker tone that eases everything. That tone honestly gives the movie room to breathe so that it can explore the characters a bit more and delve into their eccentricities without the burden of keeping the viewer engaged in the tense side of the story. The story in The Big Lebowski isn't tense. It isn't supposed to be. It's supposed to be a good time with a ton of laughs, ton of eccentric characters, and an easygoing pace that makes it a fun watch whenever the occasion arises. And you know what? I'm willing to take some flack for this video. I know that some of my takes in this video are controversial, but I found myself enjoying the comedies like Fargo and The Big Lebowski more than some of their serious films. But what else can I say besides, that's just my opinion, man.